So I don't want to get too crazy with these RFCs. I'm going to break this one and some of the longer ones up into parts. So this will be part 1. Be on the lookout for part 2. But RFC 1034 is all about domain names, concepts, and facilities. And I thought it was interesting they chose the word facilities, but if you use the word use to substitute it the entire time, it makes a lot of sense. And if you think about the context this word is in, right next to the word concepts here. So in that context, first you have the concept of something, and then all the details are after. So that's what this RFC is going to cover. All the details that go into domain names. Okay, so the first thing to note about this RFC, it's going to omit many details which can be found in a companion RFC called Domain Names, Implementation, and Specification, and that's the one right after this, 1035. The author goes on to talk about assumptions. Let's take a look at the author real quick. Not going to try to pronounce that name. But this RFC introduces domain style names. They're used for internet mail and host address support, and the protocols and servers used to implement domain name facilities. So the RFC introduces names, blah blah blah, and protocols and servers used to implement domain name uses. So if you want to use domain names, this is the RFC to read. Now, the impetus of the development of the domain name system was growth in the internet. It's really that simple. And this picture is a picture of a city in Canada because right now, Canadians are experiencing explosive growth in mortgage credit. So because the internet's going through explosive growth, I threw that picture there. If you saw my other video about RFC226, you know about the host.txt file. This was a single file that basically was their version of DNS back then. Except every computer on the network is supposed to have this file. Back then, the computer that had this was called the Network Information Center. Now, for a computer to get this file, it needed to FTP it from the Network Information Center. Which makes me think of like it's a mama computer. But this mama had problems because the total network bandwidth consumed in distributing a new version of this scheme is proportional to the square of the number of hosts in the network, and even when multiple levels of FTP are used, the outgoing FTP load on the NIC host is considerable. I shouldn't say NIC because that's network interface card, but you know what I mean. And this paragraph is giving us the who, what, when, where, and why of this RFC, so that's pretty nice. A nice little summary here to understand why we're reading a document about domain names. Now here's a fun history fact for you. Local organizations were administering their own names and addresses, but had to wait for the NIC, or Network Information Center, to change host.txt, to make changes visible to the internet at large. Waiting for these people to update the file must have been painful. So they came up with this design using a distributed database and generalized resources. So they came up with this design to use a distributed database. And they call it a database, but in my mind, I always imagine it as a table with 2 columns. One column is the host name, and the other column is the IP address that host name is connected to. But if you watched my other video on RFC1034, you'll know why I say right here, I'm just a simple regular person though, so that thinking is not quite correct. And their first crack at DNS wasn't correct either. So this RFC we're reading now obsoletes RFC 882, and RFC 883 is called Domain Names Implementation Specification. So they were trying to implement this database system, but this memo is the evolution of that. There you go. They say this is the evolved scheme that these 2 RFCs started. And before we dive much more into the details here, they do point out that the terms domain name are used in a few different contexts. Very often the term domain name is used to refer to a name with structure indicated by dots but no relation to the DNS. And my question mark here is because I don't know what he means when he says this is particularly true in mail addressing. But regardless, just be aware of that semantic issue as we progress here. So what's the goal of DNS? To provide consistent namespace, which will be used for referring to resources. Another goal is DNS must be maintained in a distributed manner with local caching to improve performance. They're saying here approaches that attempt to collect a consistent copy of the entire database will become more and more expensive and difficult, hence should be avoided. Then down here they say mechanisms for creating and deleting names. These should also be distributed. So DNS is this distributed system where there are trade-offs between the cost of acquiring data, the speed of updates, and the accuracy of caches, and even the source of the data itself should control the trade-off. And Cloudflare has been in the news recently because they claim to be the fastest, the speediest, not just in getting updates. They're talking about in resolving the DNS request. So thinking back to these simpler times they lived in at the time of this RFC, the 80s, right? They wrote that we should be able to use names to retrieve host addresses, mailbox data, and other as yet undetermined information. So the first thing that came to my mind was Netflix data. Yes, DNS helps us do that. Now, because we want the namespace to be useful in dissimilar networks and applications, we provide the ability to use the namespace with different protocol families or management. So I said agreed right here. If you want video, or if you want pictures, or if you want a mixture of these things, if you want mail, or if you want to securely log into another computer, all these different protocols, that ability needs to be there. And doing all those things through one single system, such as DNS, makes sense. So the domain name system tags all data with a class as well as the type so that we can allow parallel use of different formats for data of type address. They should have just put a period right there. So we want different formats of data, yes. Here we want name server transactions to be independent of communications systems that carry them. So if we're talking about a datagram networks, datagram systems, or virtual circuits, sometimes you need these for reliability, which makes me think about maybe banks or stock market transactions. They're saying regardless of the transaction type, DNS can still be used. So if we scroll down here a little bit, the next important thing to talk about is the administrative boundaries used to distribute responsibility for this DNS database will usually correspond to organizations that have one or more hosts. Each organization that has the responsibility for a particular set of domains will provide redundant name servers, either on the organization's own host or other hosts that the organization arranges to use. And this right here just makes good sense. If everybody behaves in this way, that's good for business. So I never heard of any problems with this little mandate here in the RFC. But speaking of problems, here are some. It says clients of the domain name system should be able to identify trusted name servers they prefer to use before accepting referrals to name servers outside of this trusted set. Where was my rogue DNS meme? I know it was around here somewhere. That's what they're talking about right there. So if your sysadmin denies you access of a particular IP, you should thank them. Now, in any system that has a distributed database, a particular name server may be presented with a query that can only be answered by some other server. The two general approaches to dealing with the problem are recursive, in which the first server pursues a query for the client at another server, and iterative, in which the server refers the client to another server and lets the client pursue the query. Both approaches have advantages and disadvantages, but the iterative approach is preferred for the datagram style of access, and the domain name system, or the domain system, requires implementation of the iterative approach, but allows a recursive approach as an option. So I always knew about the iterative one, but I mean this recursor idea is totally new to me. I'll let you go do your individual research on that one. Here they say the domain system assumes that all data originates in master files scattered throughout the hosts that use the system. These master files are updated by local system administrators. So right here we have our first mention of a sysadmin, which is separate from the user who uses programs to access name servers through standard programs called resolvers. Now we can skip this paragraph and jump to each host's name servers and resolvers are configured by a local system administrator. And that makes me wonder, back in 1987, how many high school students knew at this time that this is a job they can grow up to do? Well, in order to know how to do that job right, you could read RFC1034, which is titled Domain Administrator's Operations Guide. And this one is actually pretty funny if you go to this link to read it, because there's something in there It's like advice being given to the domain administrator, system administrator, whatever, where they're saying you should complain privately. It's being given as advice regarding what to do in some sort of sucky situation. So definitely an RFC you should check out. As we're nearing the end here, I think it's funny they take the system administrator's jobs and break it apart from the domain system itself. Like, the system just provides standards. That's all the system does. The administrator, though, has to define zone boundaries, provide master files of data, updates to master files, and statements of the refresh policies desired. So that right there is the perfect stopping point. In part 2, we'll go ahead and go over elements of DNS and just keep on reading RFC 1034.